let me do that by saying a big thank you to everyone for being part of this conversation, this session, including the community of the Cathedral and the wider community as well, of which there are a fair number present apparently. And I would like a special note of thanks, just to make a special note of thanks to Deborah and to Bertrand for accommodating this in our activities. And a special thanks as well to SJAG and Brenda in particular for facilitating the setting up of this session. And I have to say it was planned as one of about 45 minutes in duration with some time for questions and conversation, but it's not exactly, as I said already, in fact, the presenter has allowed that there can be questions for those of you who can catch attention during the presentation, and that will be managed. But for those of you who are not able to catch attention during the presentation, please, if you're willing, put your questions on the chat so that they can be dealt with at the end of the session. And I will say that from a practical perspective as well, that we had allowed that there would be an official interpreter with us to make sure that even though the presentation is essentially in English, that there will be accommodation for French material as well, questions and answers. But that interpreter unfortunately hasn't made it, but I understand that we have someone waiting in the wings to ensure that that happens anyway. So please be comfortable with the language question. And just by way of now introducing the actual event, you all know, I think, or most of you know, that our Bishop Mary was one of 40-something bishops who signed a letter to the Prime Minister and other ministers of government back last year in May, recommending that the guaranteed basic income, and you'll hear that term, and UBI, universal basic income, be taken up by the country as not only astute financial policy, but because it marks our identity as a country who cares for one another. Arising from that, Bishop Mary asked Nancy and myself to pilot some additional work in the diocese, and we've done that by, first of all, pulling together an ad hoc team, one of the members of which is Terry, and Terry is here with us this morning, and it's Terry Berman who is going to introduce our speaker. So I think I've covered the territory for the moment, and I'm willing to hand over to Terry. Terry, if there's any other additional pre-information that needs to be mentioned that I've neglected.
No, I don't think so, Peter. Good morning, everyone.
Terry. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are very, very fortunate today to have as our presenter a person who's extremely knowledgeable and experienced on the issue of basic income. Sheila Regehr is a founding member of the Basic Income Canada Network and former executive director of the National Council of Welfare. Her 29 years of federal public service spanned frontline work, policy analysis and development, international relations, and senior management, with a focus on improving fairness and equality, and on gender and race in particular. She has policy expertise in areas of income security and taxation, such as child tax benefits, child support, maternity, parental benefits, pensions, and social assistance. Her insight also comes from experiencing poverty as a young parent. Sheila is grateful in her retirement to have resources, time, and health to do volunteer work and help care for her twin grandsons. Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Terry. I would just add that the most recent addition to my biography is asleep beside me. There's a new puppy in the family. So far, He's behaving himself. He's on a schedule where he should just nap for a while, but just a warning. So thank you very, very much for inviting me. It's so wonderful to see so many people. One of the things that just strikes me about this movement is the number of amazing, amazing people who are committed to this and donating their time and skills and resources. And it's just growing and growing exponentially recently, I think. So as Peter said, I'm going to cover a few things first, and then I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions, rather than, having people looking puzzled and going, what on earth is she talking about? I don't get this. So rather than going through the whole thing, I'll pause periodically to kind of test the waters. And I'm sure you'll all get tired of hearing me speak. One of the things that I was hoping my colleague, who unfortunately couldn't make it, I thought we would start out just talking a bit about what brought us to the basic income movement, because what we found when you look at people across the country and around the world, there are so many different paths leading people to this issue that it's quite astounding. One of our new board members has a degree in neuroscience, and she's a trauma specialist. So she has seen, for example, the trauma of what happened to a community based on resources when that started drying up, and the community faced crisis without the economic resources to be resilient and sustain themselves. And she said that it really has lasting impact on people. Another one of our board members is a real high-tech genius in a way, and he's an entrepreneur. He's got quite a valuable company. He came to our board because he said he believes in technology, he believes in some of these advances, but he knows he's putting people out of work. And he said he didn't come into this world to be a sociopath. So we all come from different places. So I'm going to start out sharing a bit more of a personal story about my period in poverty, which I think really helped me later on resonate with the basic income movement. So there's a period of time when I was recently separated. I was a lone parent. I had 2 young children. I thought I needed to do something else with my life. So I decided to go back to grad school. It was a really fortunate period of time in Ontario where welfare included different arrangements. And there was one called family benefits for people with children that was both more generous and less onerous for those families. And you could also get student loans. I think it's mixed across the country now. Shortly after that, that was outlawed. And there's a case of a woman in Ontario who actually committed suicide because she was accused of fraud for doing what I did legally. But what happened to me during that period of time was essentially I had a basic income. I had this family benefit. I was very fortunate that I had one intake interview with a worker, and then they left me alone. They just left me alone. I got into grad school, I changed cities, and then I got a placement with the federal government, which pays placements really well. So I could have been making money. And I said, no, I can't do that for a period of 3 months. I can only get $200 or there will be paperwork. I have too many things to do in my life to deal with social assistance paperwork. I could not do it for any amount of money. So that was my experience. I mean, I got the really good end of the way a basic income system sort of thing could work, but also a taste of what most people on social assistance face. And that's like an enormous waste of their time in lots of ways by trying to, meet all of these regulations, constraining people's lives, not allowing education that's going to get people ahead. So that sort of informed the rest of the, I had always been interested in policy. That sort of informed the rest of the work I did. So that's how I come here. Lots of different routes, but I think that story was pivotal, very personal one. So now I'm going to start with the what is basic income. Peter had mentioned that you'll hear different terms. You'll hear guaranteed basic income, guaranteed annual income, UBI. Sometimes the U means universal, sometimes it means unconditional. None of the names really mean anything. You have to ask a few more questions to find out what they're really about. But there are essentially two basic models. A lot of people in Canada, as well as the United States, heard about Andrew Yang and his proposal when he was vying for the leadership of the Democratic Party there. So this was $1,000 for every single adult in the country, and then whatever happens else, we worry about that later. So like everybody would get a check in his proposal. That's not really what anybody is talking about in Canada seriously now. We are most fortunate that we have experience with basic income type programs that are delivered differently. So seniors benefits, for example, old age security is like Andrew Yang's plan, the Democrat. Almost everybody gets a check of the same amount of money if you're over 65. And it's only in the upper income brackets that it starts getting taxed back. Added to that is a guarantee, and I think it's quite amazing that the government actually named something that means what it says, the guaranteed income supplement. So it is a guaranteed income for seniors that whatever other resources you do or don't have, your income won't fall below a certain line. Now, we haven't solved seniors' poverty, that's for sure, and we still have some work to do there. But compared to a 64-year-old living on social assistance, getting access to seniors' benefits at 65 is like winning the lottery. We also have a partial basic income in the form of child benefits. So again, this is one of those interesting names. Somebody, part of our movement, heard one minister back in the 1990s when this was announced, mention the words basic income in the room, but it wasn't recorded and it never got in print and it never got mentioned again. It's like, no, we can't talk about that. But it's a child benefit. Well, it doesn't go to children. I have grandchildren. If their benefit went to them, like they use it up on Lego or Star Wars or video games or something, it goes to parents. This is the adult group that many people seem to be worried about are going to be irresponsible. It's called a child benefit because it's based on the number of children in the household, which is quite appropriate, but nobody monitors how you spend that money. So money for your children might be rent or food or your own education to help you support your children. So it is unconditional. So we know how to do this in Canada. We have the mechanisms to do it. We certainly can improve upon them, but we've got good examples. So we're not starting from scratch here, and we're not likely to do it Andrew Yang's way. Just one other major thing I'll mention that comes up internationally, I don't know so much in Canada, but there's sometimes this basic income guarantee is called a means tested model. That's the terminology that's often used internationally, and it's in the Basic Income Earth Network Bible definition, in a sense. In Canada, however, we make a clear distinction between means testing of the sort that's done for social assistance and income testing. So means testing under social assistance, as Peter alluded earlier, it's intrusive. They go into your bank accounts. I worked in a community at one point where the local administrator would go into your cupboards and criticize the brand of tuna you were buying as too expensive and would reduce your money. the potential for abuse in that kind of system, it is just enormous, and it's completely demoralizing and humiliating for people. So that's a much wider range of means that is examined in a very intrusive way. Income testing, however, most of us see quite differently. We're all income tested. Everything is. You can't get away from the tax system, and the tax system is based on income and your ability to pay. So we deliver child benefits, seniors benefits, GST credits, all sorts of programs are based on our level of income. So this is quite normal. It's not intrusive. It's not anything special that you're attaching to a new group of people now. It's something that's pretty common to all of us. So those are the kind of major distinctions. We therefore in Canada see our basic income guarantee model as still universal. So it's universal in the way that healthcare is. It's there when you need it. When your health deteriorates for whatever reason, you get treatment, you get healthcare. In this case, if your income drops to a certain extent, no matter what it was last year, you might have been a millionaire. If you're not making any money this year, you will get access to a basic income guarantee. So that's kind of the basic nuts and bolts. And I'll stop here and see if I've confused anybody so far, or if there were questions. So I can't see everybody. I have too big a view of my face here.
What sort of paperwork would you have had to done if you made more than $200 at that time? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what it does, the first thing is it draws attention to you. So you're a person that so far they haven't had any contact with. They just keep sending you your checks. As soon as there's a change of any sort, it's like, oh, there's a change. We need to pay attention to this person. I wonder what she's doing. So it would open the door for them to investigate just about anything else they wanted. So I would have to fill out paperwork declaring how much income I had earned in a particular period of time. If they had paid me what they were offering, it basically would have taken me off the welfare system for a period of time. My children would have lost a certain amount of, health and dental benefit that they got. And then I would have had to face reapplying later when that placement ran out, which would have brought, like a whole new set of circumstances. Yeah, you're just like, once you're in the system, and now it's really strict. I mean, there's just constant reporting of everything that goes on in your life. Anybody else, or shall I continue? Okay.
A couple of people with hands up.
Sheila, is this going to put all those snoopy people out of work?
That's a great question. And that's one of the ones that comes up. So I'll share another story, because I very often find these practical examples work better than just about anything. So I was a speaker at a conference of OMSA, which is the Ontario Municipal Social Services Association. So in Ontario, municipal governments have a role in delivering social services and dealing with clients and that sort of thing. We were sitting around a table during the basic income consultation, talking to them about different things. And this question came up within this group of social workers. And one of them looked around at her colleagues and she says, "Does any of you actually get to practice social work?" And they all went, "Heck no." They don't. They spend their time policing money. They don't do what they've been trained to do. They don't have time. The system doesn't really allow them. So one of the things they started thinking about then is, what else you do under a basic income system? How do you start redesigning things? How do you start looking at where services are really needed and how you design them with clients, not for them? So I think there's tremendous opportunity to improve other areas as well.
Heather Stevens has her hand up. Heather Stevens. Do you have a question?
I just wanted to say, when I retired and didn't have a pension, I got the GIS and I didn't have to promise anything or sell my soul to the devil, and it comes and it's absolutely fabulous. So if you can use that as a model, go for it.
Thank you so much.
Michelle?
Sheila, I was just wondering, did you find that there was a difference or change in depending on who was in government?
So I'm not quite sure I understand.
So was there, you said there's a lot more paperwork now, so I'm wondering, is the paperwork related to who is in government?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's one of the key problems with social assistance. I mean, there are a number. So there are 13 different systems across the country. In my old job, we reported on these annually. Every year, things changed. Every time there was a government change, things changed. And very often, a more retrograde government would come in, scale things back. And then if a newer, friendlier government came in the next time, they would partially correct, but not fully. So it's really easy for benefits to erode over time. It's really easy for people to get caught with mistakes being made, simply because the rules are so many and they change so often. It's really hard for people to keep up.
Caroline Jondal has her hand up.
Make sure thank you. My Wi-Fi in my other room is very bad. That's why I needed my questions posted. So I'm here ad-libbing. I think we have to be very, the last question reminded me of one of my questions, and that is to be really politically wise and aware. So I'm just wondering, with the current level of debt, even if there is a very strong or broad agreement that GPI or UPI is desired, but with the current level of debt, for example, how realistic is it? Or will the parties or the party that is elected next forget many of the promises of the Liberal government, for example, from the 1980s? You know, childcare is a good example, were dropped. And although this is a guaranteed basic income, is a highly advocated for program now, as childcare was over the decades, how realistic is it to expect with the current level of debt growing and growing, that it too will be either dropped or modified to such a degree, or with little cooperation among the 10 provinces and territories, will it actually survive? Sorry, it's a bit of a pessimistic question, but you have so much experience. I would love to hear your response.
Yeah, I think it's a very realistic question, and I don't think any of us should be shying away from that realism.
Mm-hmm.
If I can, I'm going to go through the next couple of sections because I'm going to start to address that question, but we're going to get more and more into the weeds and into the details of some of these kinds of things, and certainly the politics of it.
Thank you.
So I'll go quickly through the next one because I don't think it requires a lot of explanation to this group of people, but it's one of the questions I'm often asked when I'm out, so I'll go through it, and that's why we need it. So for a lot of people, the reason they come to a basic income is because of poverty and the fact that we've tried a number of solutions and they don't work. What we see, so I'm partially answering your question because I'm saying that a lot of these reasons that I'm going to go through for a basic income are not going to go away. Like they're actually mounting. So poverty, if we don't find a way to address it, is simply going to get worse. And I think once we get a full tally of the devastation of COVID's economic impact on people, I think some people are going to be shocked. Like I hear stories that are just horrible. So, and poverty, polarization, income inequality is getting worse. I mean, billionaires are just raking it in throughout this pandemic, while lots of people are, you know, getting evicted and going hungry. We have automation and the technological disruption that comes with that. So whether you're a believer that new jobs are going to magically appear for everybody and it's not really going to be as bad as we think, or you don't, there are transitions involved. And in a knowledge economy like we have, you can't just take somebody who worked in one field and get them into a job tomorrow that's going to give them enough money to pay the rent and feed their kids in the meantime. You need some ability to transition. We have racism that, in combination with class and gender issues, again, is a growing problem in this country because it's been left unaddressed and things are now deteriorating. Insecurity is growing for a lot of people, and I think COVID really highlighted this, that a lot of people, I think, thought they were, you know, pretty comfortable. Certain things happen to other people, but not to them, and they know better now. So I think that's good. There are lots of cases now developing for basic income. So recognizing that COVID hit women hard, there's a solid case for basic income for women. Arts and culture workers were one of the first to really get on the bandwagon with this, excuse me, because their incomes have always been precarious. And creative endeavors that are so important to our society, like unpaid care work, are not very well rewarded. So we've got a funny system where, you know, the things that are the most important things to us in life really don't have much value in our economy. And a basic income can help turn that around. And then there's the basic human rights moral argument. Again, another really, for this group in particular, story that I think is kind of cool. A colleague of mine organized a small kind of workshop with a number of faith-based scholars. So from different religious faiths and Indigenous perspectives as well, to look at basic income. So they went through all of the scholarly texts, and of course they would report that you're not going to see the words basic income there. But what surprised them, and that I thought was really interesting, was, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the common good, about, you know, treating others according to the golden rule kind of thing. But what they found was there was actually far less discussion of poverty and that reason for something like a basic income, and a lot of discussion about the problem of wealth. And I think that resonates really clearly today. I think people focused on poverty need to look at the other end. I think like wealth accumulation is becoming just a huge problem that's preventing us from finding good solutions. So that's the end of that. The next section I want to talk about, just very briefly, is what do we know? So I was at a meeting a little while ago with a number of members of parliament, and one of them was arguing very strongly for a new pilot in Canada. Many of you know we had the Manitoba pilot in the 1970s, and the recent Ontario one that was unfortunately canceled early. But this argument that we need another Canadian pilot was put out there, and immediately several people, including me, jumped up to say, we really do have the evidence we need, and another pilot isn't going to tell us anything new. Anything that's going to make any difference to what we do. We need to get to work to design this. So what we find just very broadly from the pilots in Canada and the United States in the 70s, from the recent pilot, from pilots that are being conducted in all sorts of places around the world with different populations, the same pattern of evidence emerges everywhere. There's better health outcomes, there's better education outcomes, there's more trust in communities. People have more opportunities for employment, self-employment, entrepreneurship. It's like the pattern is there. There's a reduction in violence and a lot of the other social ills that we often see, that we associate with poverty in particular, alcohol abuse and that sort of thing. Those things decrease. So the pattern is there. I mean, the particularities are going to differ, but the pattern is there. So I'll break here again before I get into the real details and the policy environment. So anything to discuss right now? Ah, yes, I see healthcare costs. Absolutely. Can I see hands up, but I'm not moderating. Can I answer the healthcare question?
I am theoretically, but I'm missing hands. So by all means, just jump in if you see a hand, anybody.
Carolyn's hand is up. Carolyn?
I think she's lost her connection. She was waving her arms and she's sort of frozen in that position.
Is there another
Crystal's
question?
hand is also up.
I wondered.
Can I? Okay, I think this is related to what you just said, Sheila. It's Terry. Yeah, are there any precedents in any other countries for a basic income guarantee policy that has worked over a period of time?
That's a great question, and it comes back in a sense to Canada's leadership in this. Sort of unacknowledged leadership. So when several of us back in the early to mid 2000s, there were a number of people in Ottawa, Senator Hugh Segal, Senator Art Eggleton, some non-governmental organizations, some other parliamentarians from the House, from all parties. We started investigating solutions to poverty, and we discovered this North American network. So we went to a meeting and we found out what was going on in the rest of the world. And at that point, there was a great deal of discussion about what was happening in Brazil, because they had introduced a policy called the Bolsa Familia. So eventually this policy is supposed to cover everybody, but at that period of time with the implementation of it, it was mostly families in poverty and families with children. And there were a couple of conditions attached to it. I think your children had to be in school up to a certain age. And I think they had to get regular medical checkups or vaccinations or something. I'm not sure on the details, but there were some conditions. So we Canadians kind of looked at each other and went, well, if that's a basic income, we've got one too. We've got a couple of them. So, you know, I think because Canada has these basic income-like programs that have been run and run successfully and have gained political traction for years and years, I think we really do have some leadership. And now you see in the United States, they're advocating for the kind of child benefit program that we have too, as a move towards a basic income. One of the other, so there's Alaska, but I won't talk about that because it's more a Demogrant model. Some of the other things that were interesting in France, for example, not France, in Finland, there were some people who were a bit dismissive of the pilot there, saying, well, it didn't really show any startling results, you know, there wasn't huge employment increases or something like that. But there were actual increases, and people who had had jobs before took a little bit longer to get them, but then they did better. And when they asked employers about this, they basically said, we really like to hire happier people. People who come to us who are miserable and hungry and not sleeping and constantly worried about what's going to happen next. They don't make good employees. So happiness matters. Having some confidence matters. And that came out in the Ontario pilot very, very clearly.
Thank you.
We have questions from Crystal and from Caroline.
Crystal, please go ahead.
I was wondering, I'm curious if there were any kind of data as to the health outcomes. I know the second pilot in Ontario was brief, but was there any research on that about how? Anyway, I'll leave it with you.
Yeah, so you're right. We missed a lot by not being able to complete that pilot. But one of the interesting kind of things that happened was we did manage to put a lot of pressure on them to release the intake survey. And from the intake survey, one of the things that was just so startling was the very high extent of people facing moderate to severe anxiety, depression, lots of mental health concerns. There were lots of physical concerns as well. And on the non-health side, the key thing that struck me was how many people thought they were just in dead-end jobs completely. So we were very fortunate that we had managed to build a bit of a database of our own. So when the pilot ended and the research team, the real researchers, had to hand everything in, we still knew who a lot of these people were. And they had agreed, not that we would do research on them, but they would agree that they would help support activism for this. So we surveyed them. And out of that survey, the responses that we got, and again, it's not scientific and it's not a representative sample, but we did get well over 400 people responding. And the pattern that we saw was really quite dramatic and quick mental and physical health improvements. So we've got stories from people, they told us they either reduced or went off medication entirely. One man, and this gets to the employment effects, one man took sort of a month off. Like I think he had been doing a couple of different jobs or something and was just exhausted and worn out. He took some time off to get his head together and his physical well-being beefed up so that he then could go out and really get a good job and do a good job at it. So some of those, and another one that, again, if you had a social assistance worker who's questioning what you do, probably would have rejected this one. But we learned from one woman, for example, that she used some of her basic income to buy a gym club membership. So what that got her was physical exercise, needed weight loss, and a social network, all in one. Like it's just so mind-boggling to think that if you simply give people the opportunity, they will find things that work for them.
Peggy, you wanted to ask a question in.
Yeah, I was just
Caroline.
wondering if there's any idea that this might affect wages, that if those who employ people in the less skilled jobs will just say, well, they're already getting $1,000 a month or whatever, let's sweat a little more out of them and keep more money for ourselves. Or is that an evil thought that no employer would ever have?
Yes, a evil thought. So, yeah, some of this is a bit unpredictable. We did hear this concern come up with CERB when employers were saying, well, I can't get people to come to work because they're getting their CERB benefit. And our response was, well, they also might not want to come to work because they don't want to kill their grandparents by bringing COVID home. Just as another example, so figuring out a long-term permanent policy based on a COVID year is not the best idea in the world. But there were different theories on this. I mean, one theory is, and that does tend to be borne out by the evidence, is that people have a little bit more negotiating power with employers, and they have more options. Like I said, the man who took longer to get a job, but then he got a good job. Another man tried out 2 or 3 different jobs before he found one that he thought was a good fit for him, that he could really stick with. If he had been on social assistance or just desperately needed the money, he would have been stuck in a horrible dead-end job that he was no good at for many, many years.
Excellent.
So there's that. So I think from an employee perspective, it's great. And as I mentioned from Finland, from an employer perspective, like if you really are a credible, good, fair employer, you benefit from employees who are healthy and able to do their job. But the issue of, you know, people being underpaid and other abuses, there's labor legislation and all kinds of stuff for that, and there needs to be.
There does. Thank you.
Caroline.
Paul, you have a question too.
Caroline.
Well, Paul first, please, because I've questioned one. I would like to, but Paul hasn't had the opportunity, please.
We're very good friends with a German economist who is advising governments, and they do all this thing. He says a society that's functioning can support 5% or so of the population that does not work, because there are people who are just can't work, won't work, or whatever it is. He said that's okay. The problem is if it gets higher. But the main problem now is in capitalism, where markets change and everything is in flux. The incredible fear that puts in people, the guaranteed income would get rid of that and give just a little bit of a buffer to those people. But we can accept that 5% won't work or can't, whatever. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it raises the larger issue too of what is work. Most people, when they're talking about, they confuse work and employment, and they're not the same thing. What we found in the Manitoba experiments, for example, is that this quote unquote reduction in work was not that for women. It was a reduction in employment so that they could look after their newborn babies, which is work. No matter how much you love your kids, changing diapers and stuff is work. So this work that people do is really varied and really dynamic. So there's a period of time when you need to spend a little bit more time with your teenager, for example, and then you get over that, and then you can increase your hours at your paid job. There are so many ways in which life demands that we be flexible and adapt to these kinds of things. And the paid labor force really doesn't do a very good job of allowing us to be human.
Carolyn, you've had questions you've been being patient about. Do you have something you want to ask right now?
Thank you. I'm not patient at all. I wanted this to come in several decades ago, but thank you. Sheila, this is quite amazing and wonderful to have you and everybody here. So I am curious about something. From my perspective, context is extremely important to understand how these sociological, economic forces and change happens. And you mentioned the pandemic, of course. I just want to preface that by saying this is a very favorable time, as we know, just like after World War II, and veteran benefits, for example, came in because the world was ready for it and Canada stepped up. So I see this as very, very promising. And I wonder, how did this change from social workers and people like yourself advocating for it to major economists you know, the report, which I can't cite the name of, excuse me, because I have long-term COVID memory loss. But in any case, from the report in January, which you may wish to name, I was stunned by major economists advocating for it with very strong research and voice. And I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay, so that's getting into my last section here that really is into the politics and the weeds of some of this stuff. I think there are a few answers. So I think one of them is there's the idea that good ideas are lying around waiting for a crisis, and we're very fortunate around the world and in Canada that there were a number of people that did do a good job on basic income and keeping things alive for a while, waiting for the moment. So a lot of good work was done and people were prepared when this moment arrived. We also find, I think, and this is all in addition to COVID, because I think COVID like really made people wake up. The other thing I think is that there were quite a number of people who were confused about what a basic income really means, which is why I always start out with, we're not talking about sending checks to billionaires in Canada. That's not the model that anybody is really proposing now, even if they think in the very long run that might be the ideal. And then the last thing is there were a lot of people who were on the fence or thought basic income was a good idea, but just impractical and it was never going to happen. And then all of a sudden, you know, the crisis arose and it's, wow, we really need this and it just might happen. And now we're on the bandwagon. And then gradually the basic income movement itself has just exploded. With new sectors, new people, new organizations. It's phenomenal.
Oops.
Okay, I see Patrick and Brenda still, did you still have a question too?
No, I'm just trying to catch other people's questions.
James and Stephanie.
The people who have their
questions.
hands up are Stephanie and James and Crystal.
Patrick.
And Patrick.
And Patrick. Okay.
Just because he's close to me on my screen.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Okay. The way in which the elites ignore the interests of communities, institutions, and working people indicates that this astute comment, Sheila, of your technological friend, I didn't want to be a sociopath. It's a kind of organized sociopathy. The way maybe the basic income can, from the grassroots, affect the dynamic here is if you allow unemployed people to take their time finding a job until they find the good one. So that increases their connection to their home and neighborhood, and it gives them roots and the institutions. And if employers react to say, we value good employees and we understand they want to stay here, and we are therefore a part of the community. And looking at big tech, for instance, I mean, big tech ought to be told that society invested in the training of your workers, invested in the infrastructure that enable you to make these tremendous profits, and that we are going to make sure that you're going to take some of these super profits and pay them as taxes and be actively involved in extending the capabilities that technology give through people who are disadvantaged and communities that need a boost. So spread the knowledge around and enable workers generally to have a higher level of competence and to solve their own problems. So it's basic income is a part of a root of a whole network, and makes a positive contribution, you know.
Absolutely.
If you have a comment, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not a question. That's just like, I agree wholeheartedly. I think the problem of elites really is a serious one that a lot of governments have to tackle. And the idea of community resilience and understanding communities. I listened to a webinar a little while ago, put on by somebody whose name I can't remember because I just don't remember things the way I used to. I don't know what the reason is. His name, is something Pearl, Morris Pearl. Anyway, he is somebody with a lot of money who is arguing very strongly that he should be taxed appropriately because he's got all of this money. And he said, you know, people out there laboring for minimum wages. And he said, I don't go to work. Like I don't have to put my labor into anything. My money comes to me through my investments and through my capital gains. And my capital gains are taxed at a far lower rate than all of the rest of you. So, but he was very sincere in like recognizing that this is just wrong. Like it's just imbalanced. And he also made the argument, we've got so many warped systems, this race to the bottom. I just listened to a show on CNN this morning too about taxation and trying to get, you know, a global taxation framework in place so that we don't have this race to the bottom. So one of the other points that Morris Pearl made as well was that people don't flock to low tax environments. He said he lives in New York. People flock to New York because there's enough taxes to pay for all of the cool things that you can do in New York. And the same is true of other communities. You want communities to be able to have things. You want good healthcare. You want an arts and culture sector. You want vibrant communities. And so to do that, you need a reasonable tax base and a reasonable distribution of income to make sure that happens.
Yeah.
And yet we still have this idea that low taxes are good. It makes no sense.
Sheila, Heather has a very quick question here, although it's a memory taxing one. She'd like to know who the name of the German economist was that you cited earlier. Or was it in fact Paul that mentioned the German?
It was Paul.
Ulrich Bloom.
Thank you.
Ulrich Bloom? Okay, thanks. And now I think there are two Stephanies and a Stephen who are all hoping to ask something. Let's do it alphabetically. Stephanie Falkai and then Stephanie Stringer.
Sure, great, thanks. I have a quick question because, well, I'm too busy to keep track of everyone's policies in politics. So who is our biggest public figure that's championing? Is it the NDP? Is it
Right,
the
like they're not gonna
Liberals?
get us anywhere.
Sorry, Peggy.
No.
So I just want to know, like, tell me who to vote for. Who's gonna put this through most quickly?
Okay, can I reserve that because that's the subject of my last section that I'm going to talk about. And was there one other question?
I think there were a couple. Stephanie S.
Well, I might ask at the end because you may be going to answer this. But James and Crystal also both have their hands up.
James, do you want to ask now or do you want to ask at the end?
Go ahead.
And Crystal?
Yeah, sure. This might dovetail with your last section, but I was just thinking, I mean, I know that the Greens, I'm from BC originally, and I know that there's a coalition, I believe, that between the Greens and the NDP, and that they had asked as a condition that they would do a study of basic income in BC, and I was so disappointed in my guys, the NDP, that they, you know, it seemed that was kind of swept under the rug. The commission basically said it's not feasible and we should do all these other things instead, most of which are probably not going to be done. And I remarked yesterday that the Liberal government at the federal level has adopted this as a very number 2 on their national platform, which I'm so happy to see. However, I mean, I was also really excited about electoral reform, and I don't want to go on too long, but I just, you know, as a kind of an idealistic person, I'm disappointed in our politicians, and I wonder if you have any kind of any sort of feedback about that, like how do these sorts of things, you know, get passed? I wonder. Yeah, that's it.
Right. Okay.
Michelle, you look as if you want to jump in here, because I suspect that was a good segue to what Sheila's going to say next. But if you want to interject something, do it.
Yes, thanks, Brenda. No, I was just wondering, if we get a basic income for everybody, don't you think that in a capitalistic kind of way, if people have a choice of what job they're going to go to, they can pick and choose because they're now secure at a certain level, that will raise the wages for everybody, because people will have a choice and they can't be beaten down to the bottom dollar. So, you know, in a way, it will work also capitalistically to improve the society.
Okay. So I'll answer that one very quickly and then move on to the last section. Yeah, I agree. Like that's another theory that a basic income will ensure that working conditions and wages improve. But I think it's a bit more complicated because of technological disruption and climate change and the transition to different kinds of jobs. Our economy is just really different than, you know, most of my generation growing up. So I think it's going to take a lot. Like, I think basic income will be a factor in a whole interplay of different things. We need different kinds of job creation. We need different kinds of projects to get us away from fossil fuels and other resource-based communities that need other things to do. So I think there's a lot going on there, but again, basic income gives people the options and the possibility to, you know, keep going as these transitions are happening. So I'm gonna finish up now with the political stuff. So again, I think COVID has made a huge difference to the political environment around basic income. But I mean, people in the movement have also put a very direct focus on the federal government, in kind of an interesting switch about Basic Income Canada Network. I mean, we've always advocated for national policy. So a lot of our focus has always been on federal government, but we kind of moved sideways a bit when Ontario started to pilot. So we worked closely with both the Ontario government and community organizations and pilot participants while that was happening. And then when it was canceled, sort of all eyes went back to the federal government again. including the Ontario Basic Income Network, and now most other networks across the country, regional and local, are putting a lot of emphasis on the federal government. To Crystal's point, I am now arguing, and I'll tell you why, because a lot is happening federally. I'm now arguing that I think we need to put more focus on provinces and municipalities again to tell the federal government that they need support. So I think Crystal's quite right that this BC report that came out that said, you know, maybe a basic income for some people, but not for everybody, and maybe we should do 95 other things in the province, that shows you the dysfunction. A province cannot do this. If Ontario and BC can't do this alone, certainly no other province is going to be able to, let alone the territories. It has to be national. It has to be both federal and provincial territorial. And I think municipal governments have a huge stake in this because they're the ones who deal with the direct health problems, sanitation problems, crime problems. I want our mayor in Toronto to stop going to the federal government asking for gun control money. And I want him to ask for a basic income so the people in those communities have some other livelihood besides stealing cars. Like, and the people in those communities identify very clearly, beginning with the Mike Harris years, when the money left, the guns came in.
Yeah.
It's clear.
Right.
So we have to stop all of this downstream trying to, you know, pull people out of the water and
upstream,
up front to stop all of those things from happening. But a province can't do it alone. I mean, they don't have the tax capacity, which is why all of these provincial social assistance measures, I spent a number of years at the National Council of Welfare. It existed for 40 years. It monitored all of this. Nothing gets better. It just doesn't. It goes like this, up and down, up, and it doesn't get better. We published a really lovely graph. Seniors, however, poverty, like before a number of changes came in, including CPP, but especially OAS, GIS, poverty is like way up here for seniors, and it goes like just down and down and down, whereas poverty for everybody else continues to go like this. Kids poverty now, because of the child benefit system, which again is a federal, provincial, territorial initiative, everybody contributes their part to it. You see child poverty going down too. So I think post-COVID, municipalities and provincial governments are in real trouble, and their citizens and residents need the kind of support that a basic income is going to provide that nothing else really can. At the federal level, what is fascinating now is that there really is a huge range of champions, more than we ever thought. So one of the key ones who was instrumental in getting things going is Senator Kim Pate. So Kim and I go back a ways. She is tenacious, she is principled, you know, she will do what needs to be done and will not be swayed by a lot of other people who, you know, think she's going too far or whatever. So she has been just amazing. And just as you wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, she got 50 senators to sign a letter to the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister supporting a basic income. 50 senators, including Murray Sinclair. So there's Indigenous support. In addition to these liberal resolutions that have come up, all parties at some point or another have agreed to implement the recommendations, the calls to action coming out of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That report calls for a basic income. I don't know if they realize that they've agreed to do that, but they have. They have all said something supportive. And if that's not the case anymore, I want somebody to tell me, I would like the people who wrote that BC report to tell me why missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls were wrong. why Black Lives Matter is wrong, why churches are wrong. Like this is important policy. And then on the House of Commons side, another couple of things have been happening. So there was a long-standing anti-poverty caucus, and that's how some of my work on this started, with people from all parties within the House. There were a small handful of people who attended, and they attended over time. Now the participation is huge, and they have opened those meetings to a certain number of civil society organizations as well. So there's greater transparency in these discussions, ability to discuss so that we get our voices heard and people understand basic income issues better, rather than just relying on the small handful of economists that they traditionally talk to, who say bad things about basic income but haven't studied it at all. And then there is Leah Gazan, who is NDP MP for Winnipeg Centre, who has the riding with the highest rate of poverty in Canada, very heavily Indigenous. She is another fighter. I mean, she just no holds barred, you know, no apologies. She understands this and she's going for it. So she's put forward motion 46, which has got we helped design that, the wording of that with them. So they consulted with groups outside to do that motion, and they've got all party support for it. Not sure what's going to happen to it. On the Liberal side, Julie Zurowitz has put forward Bill C-273. So it's more of an implementation bill that instructs government what to do. So she again has, you know, put her name on the list of champions who's willing to go out there. I want to reflect back on what Patrick was talking about, because I think what we see across parties and within unions and some other organizations as well, is that there's a bit of a divergence between grassroots and real people and leadership. And I think this is true to a certain extent in all of the political parties and in a number of organizations. The leaders just somehow aren't quite ready, but I think they're being pushed. You also have now, to add to this, Prince Edward Island. So you've got the BC report, and essentially our takeaway from that is that BC can't do it. It has to be a national program. So it's fine. PEI has done its own study, and they are trying to get cooperation from the federal government to start a basic income there. So they want an implementation pilot, which is what Julie's Bill C-273 calls for. This is not Hamilton. We're not experimenting with people anymore. We're experimenting with programs. You set up the program, you run it out, you make sure the checks go where they're supposed to. You figure out if there are people somehow being left out, how to get them in. You're testing the program. You're not experimenting on people anymore. So they simply want to be the first to start a basic income in PEI. So that gets a bit tricky, because if the federal government supports PEI, then what do other provinces and territories think? And you would think they would want to be at the table to design what this looks like. So we do need a sort of national framework like we did with the new child benefit system that we've got. Last thing I'll say is just, again, how much the movement has grown and how much it's influenced people. Nunavut is looking at feasibility. Newfoundland and Labrador is interested. And people out in our networks have just been working with everybody across parties within all sorts of different organizations. It really feels like the time is very close, and hope we get there soon.
There's a pause for a moment. I'd love to jump in with a comment.
Yeah, so now we can ask whatever we want.
Do jump in.
Okay. This feedback from something that was said previously about CERB causing people to maybe not want to work. I'm involved with some social organizations on the plateau, and I found, in fact, the opposite. It facilitated people to continue to work when the organization was unable to keep its revenue streams high enough to employ them. So basically, organizations that laid everybody off still had everybody come in on their free time and continue to work. So pay doesn't always relate to interest in position. You might find that with CERB, people will do some things for free. I know people in high paid jobs who said I would have worked for free if they had asked. So it's not always tied to just the money. Comment about low taxes came up before. I know KPMG had put for several years out new business location surveys showing that Canada was some of the best places to set up a new business because of services that the government offered, because those services gave value for money. So it's not low taxes that I think the point concern should be, it's value for money. Doesn't matter how low your taxes are if you're not getting any value from them. It doesn't matter how high they are if you're not getting value from them, but being efficient. And the last comment or question I have, which I don't think it's come up yet, is the idea that GBI is also a response to automation. As more and more things become automated, it doesn't really matter how much you want to work or how many skills you have. Your work just might not be required. So then there's a question of how to address that issue. And I think that's sort of the big unexplored and wave that's coming in the future. And that future might not be that far off.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you. And I think other people have commented that COVID has accelerated our future. Things that might have happened in 5 or 10 years have happened in a year. And that exponential change is likely to continue.
Yeah, and an organization I work with, our entire revenue stream pivoted online, whereas we had speculated as this something in the future, but people are now working remotely, people are now delivering services remotely, and this entire process has happened in a year. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite astounding to think about. When we analyze all of this, like 3 or 4 years out, when we kind of have a better sense of everything that happened. There was something else you said that I wanted to comment on, and I've forgotten. But I think it's just this idea of continuing to work. We found that in other things too. Some people suggest that maybe a jobs guarantee is better than an income guarantee. And so I listened to some people who have been researching in this area, and they sent me a video of a woman talking about an Argentinian project that they had, where they had both a basic income and a guarantee, a basic income and a job guarantee. And they suspected very strongly that in particular, with the basic income, women would be the ones who would be more inclined to stay on the basic income and not take advantage of the job guarantee. And they found the opposite. They wanted to stay working. So you're absolutely right. I mean, people are employed and not just employed, but like working, doing so many things because they think it's important. Quite a number of people in the pilots in Ontario, talked about using their basic income to keep their nonprofit going, so that they, in one case, somebody who had recovered from drug problems, was offering invaluable services to other people that weren't being provided by government, and his basic income allowed him to keep helping other people.
Sheila, it's Vivian. I'm going to step in because our congregation has been here since 10:30. We might need to get to lunch. Yes. Though I want to thank you so much. The combination of stories, which are very concrete, and practical pointers, and you're astounding.